welcome. My name is Ken Maragori. I'm a GMAT trainer with the International Scholars Program. So today we'll be looking at an important aspect of verbal reasoning, which is out of scope. So we'll be seeking to understand when an answer option is out of scope and when it falls inside the scope of the question. So let's dive right in. So out of scope is the most common avenue of elimination for verbal reasoning. So we find most of the cases where, of course, we're using process of elimination, which is the recommended way of tackling verbal reasoning questions, both in reading comprehension and critical reasoning. We find most of the times we use out of scope as a reason to eliminate an answer choice. But it still is the case that it's the most misused elimination method, in that you find the way we reach to the decision that an answer is out of scope is actually not the right way. So you end up eliminating an answer choice that may actually be the answer when labeling it as out of scope. So this is due to the nature of verbal reasoning questions, and we'll look into these and see how verbal reasoning questions are set or structured so as to kind of result in a lot of out of scope scenarios. So we're trying to define scope. So for any question with a conclusion, the question stem will revolve around it. So we're talking about many of the question types. So strengthening the argument questions, weakening the argument, assumption questions, flow questions. So any question with a conclusion, the question stem will just revolve around the conclusion. So the scope that we're talking about is defined by the conclusion of the stimulus. So the conclusion most times limits the extent of consideration, both inside the question limits and outside. So what this means is, so if you have your, say, let's call this our scope. So you have your conclusion, it kind of puts a box on what we should consider and what we should not. So first of all, it can limit the information that we are to consider. So remember, we have our premise and then we have our conclusion. So the premise is kind of the data points that we have or the set of facts. So because they are mostly sets of facts, the conclusion itself can limit itself to one or two facts. So if, say, the conclusion limits itself to one single fact, it means that even the other facts are actually out of scope. Even if the answer options actually touch on the other facts, we do not consider them because the conclusion has limited itself to one specific part of the premise. So this is how we are saying the conclusion may limit our extent of consideration, both inside the question limits and outside. So when you're talking about outside limits, is, say, the outside world or known facts. So of course, we know some facts about our world, what happens, or say if we're looking at business, we know how business works, we know what factors affect things in a certain way. But as long as the question hasn't mentioned any of that, we assume it's out of scope. And the difference is that anytime there's a conclusion, you'll probably find this statement, if true. And when if true comes about, whenever you are considering an answer option in a process of elimination, you assume that this is information that you've been given inside the scope of the question. So you have to identify if it actually impacts our conclusion or not. Otherwise, anything that's outside this if true statement, you just assume that you do not know. You just limit yourself to this small world of verbal reasoning where nothing else exists. So this is what we're calling being limited outside the question limits. So as I was saying, the greatest challenge in verbal reasoning is outside knowledge, and the information presented in verbal reasoning is confined to itself. Any information outside that must have direct impact on the conclusion to be considered inside the scope. So we have two scenarios here. So one, we have outside info that is presented in our answer choices. And then this outside info can, one, have a direct impact on the conclusion, or two, no impact. So the fact that information in the answer choice isn't presented in our premise doesn't necessarily mean that it's out of scope. So it must have no impact for us to consider it out of scope. If it has impact, you have now to consider what impact it has and see if the impact it has aligns with what our question stem requires of us. So if, say, we are strengthening the conclusion, if the impact is actually strengthening the conclusion, then we know we have found our answer choice. If the impact is weakening the conclusion, so the fact that it weakens the conclusion means it's not out of scope. It's just doing the opposite of what our question stem requires. So that way we consider it inside the scope of the question, but the impact is the opposite of what we're looking for. So the danger of, again, using out of scope to eliminate is it's easy to point out that an answer option is out of scope, hence has nothing to do with the conclusion. So if, say, you see information that doesn't seem related to our premise, it's very easy to say that it's out of scope. But as we are saying, this is synonymous with confusing a cause for an effect, or vice versa, confusing an effect for a cause. So a choice is only out of scope if it has no impact in the conclusion. So what is the solution to this? It becomes critical to think if the answer option impacts the conclusion or not. So first of all, you look for an impact. Is there an impact or is there not? So if it has an impact, you cannot rule it as out of scope. If it does, you now think about, so what impact does this answer choice have to my conclusion? Sometimes it is seemingly unrelated to the scenario, so our answer choice, but can turn out to have the biggest impact, either strengthening, weakening, or in evaluating our argument or conclusion, or explaining either paradox or so on. So whenever you have information and the question stem has kind of given you permission to consider an answer choice true, you have to think of its impact, not necessarily if it's similar to the case that we have, but if it actually impacts it. So if there's no impact, we can safely term the answer choice as out of scope. So when you know how to effectively see or point out where out of scope answer choices are, you can, in some questions, easily eliminate half of the answer choices, because as long as there's no impact, that's an out of scope answer. So with that said, we can look at an example where we will identify some answer choices that are out of scope and some of them that are not, but are also not the answer. And then we can kind of clear up how to use out of scope effectively.
You are watching Success with Bob Mwiti Show, presented to you by the International Scholars Program. The International Scholars Program is an award-winning international education financing scheme that helps bright students to pursue graduate studies abroad regardless of their financial background. You can find our programs by going to www.internationalscholarsprogram.com. The International Scholars Program, empowering dreams.
So you can go ahead and pause the video, try out the question, then you can pause and we'll discuss. So our example says the pharmaceutical industry argues that because new drugs will not be developed unless heavy development costs can be recouped in later sales, the current 20 years of protection provided by patents should be extended in the case of newly developed drugs. However, in other industries, new product development continues despite high development costs, a fact that indicates that the extension is unnecessary. Which of the following, if true, most strongly supports the pharmaceutical industry's argument against the challenge made above? So here we have a challenge of first identifying our conclusion. So our conclusion here is that, or the argument in this case, is that the extension is unnecessary because in other industries, the new product development continues despite high development costs, which is what the pharmaceutical industry is identifying as the reason why the patent duration, so 20-year protection provided by patents, should be extended. But the question stem now is telling us to support the pharmaceutical industry's argument against the challenge made above. So we're supposed to identify something that actually supports the pharmaceutical industry against the conclusion made by the challenge presented or argument. So we are simultaneously strengthening and weakening something. So we are weakening our conclusion here and strengthening the pharmaceutical industry argument. So when we are looking at the answer choices, we will be looking at anything that impacts the two of them. So either something that weakens this conclusion or something that strengthens the pharmaceutical industry's position, or both. So let's look at answer option A. Now, industries other than the pharmaceutical industry have asked for an extension of the 20-year limit on patent protection. So this option kind of seeks to tell us that because no industry has asked for an extension, then the pharmaceutical industry shouldn't be asking for an extension. So does this have an impact? It does, but what impact does it have? Because remember, we want to support the pharmaceutical industry's position. So this tells us that the pharmaceutical industry shouldn't be asking for an extension, which is actually the opposite of what we need. So it has an impact, but an opposite impact. So eliminate A. B. Clinical trials of new drugs which occur after the patent is granted. So not after. And before the new drug can be marketed. So trials occur after the patent, but before any, of course, if the drug is not marketed, it won't be sold. So it often takes as long as 10 years to complete. So remember, the protection is 20 years, and you can sometimes you can only sell the drugs after 10 years. So you only have 10 years of patent protection to sell your drug. So this now makes it a bit different from other industries, where probably after a patent, the product can be sold pretty much immediately. So this now sets the pharmaceutical industry apart from other industries. It actually makes sense that this patent duration should be extended. So this actually strengthens the pharmaceutical industry's position and weakens the conclusion of the argument that we have that the extension is unnecessary. So we can keep B. C. There are several industries in which the ratio of R&D costs to revenues is higher than it is in the pharmaceutical industry. So here we are talking about costs. So we are comparing pharmaceutical industry costs versus other industry costs. So if we look at the conclusion that we have, is that since other industries, in other industries, new product development continues. So they continue developing new products despite high development costs. So this means that an extension for the pharmaceutical industry is unnecessary. And then our answer option here says several industries have a ratio of research and development to revenues being higher than the pharmaceutical industry. So this again kind of presents a scenario where we are comparing information in other industries versus information in the pharmaceutical industry. And does it have an impact? No, not really. And even if it's talking about cost, it doesn't have an impact on our conclusion because it's kind of insinuating that all industries must have the same costs. So what we are actually dealing with is the intricacies of one industry versus the rest. So it's not really necessary that all industries have to be the same or that the ratio of research development and revenue is the same, or it should be higher for an industry for this patent duration to be extended. So this is one of the out of scope answers. Then D, an existing patent for a drug does not legally prevent pharmaceutical companies from bringing to market alternative drugs, provided they are sufficiently dissimilar to the patented drug. So this has an impact, but of the opposite, with an opposite effect. Why? Because it shows that there is actually no need for a patent. Why? Because a patent is supposed to protect your product so that no company kind of copies your idea. But if a patent doesn't legally prevent any other company from kind of making a replica of your drug, as long as it's sufficiently dissimilar. So it means that the patent now actually becomes weaker. And if the patent is weaker, it means even an extension won't be necessary. So this kind of supports the conclusion that we should be weakening. So it has an impact, but an opposite impact. We can eliminate D. Then E, much recent industrial innovation has occurred in products. For example, in the computer and electronic industries for which patent protection is very ineffective. So again, kind of like C, we have some industries where patent protection is ineffective. So the fact that it's ineffective in these other industries does not mean that it's ineffective in pharmaceutical industry. So this now means that this option has really no impact on any of our conclusions. So for that reason, we can see E is actually out of scope and we can eliminate. So we can pick safely our answer as B. So we can see from this that you can be able to identify the impact and tell what kind of impact you have. You can easily tick off C and E. Then you have A, B, and C to contend with when choosing the answer. And that actually becomes or makes your life easier when dealing with verbal reasoning questions, especially process of elimination. And this works both for critical reasoning and reading comprehension. So um, that will be the end of our lesson today on out of scope. And to know more or to see how we can use out of scope for effective eliminations, you can go to our website at kenyaelitprogram.com and join the ISP GMAT training for more guidance on how to solve GMAT questions effectively. So that was all for today's lesson, and we'll see you on the next one. Bye.